This is Mary E. Knight. She's the Associate Vice President for Finance for the University of Texas at Austin. She's worked for the University of Texas at Austin for 32 years. She's previously served as the Budget Director, a Payroll Manager, and the Assistant Director in the Office of Internal Audits. She's a Certified Public Accountant, and she's a Certified Information Systems Auditor. She's earned her Bachelor of Business Administration and Accounting degree from the University of Texas at Austin, and she's also a graduate of Leadership Austin. Please help me welcome Mary Knight.
Thank you. Well, good morning. We are going to focus on the budget process and what happens in the state of Texas with higher education, formula funding, various issues. So I'm going to give you a brief state budget overview and then talk about the formula funding and how that works for higher education for general academics. So I won't be talking about health institutions. They have a different formula, but I guess I'm going to be learning about that formula because the University of Texas at Austin is about to start a medical school. So that's something I'll be learning soon. Then higher education, some legislative funding issues, some big things that have been happening over the last couple of years in higher education funding, and then how an institution handles the budget process and the overall funding, budgeting activities. So just a brief state budget overview. So the state has a lot of different funding sources. State tax collections, biggest one. We get some federal funds. There's fees, fines, and licenses that we all pay. Interest and investment income. Lottery has been a big item lately. State land income, and then there's just other various sources. And we really focus on different methods of finance with our state budget. So my boss, Kevin Hegarty, came from a private company, and he said all money was green. Well, in the higher education world and state budgeting world, there's a lot of different colors of money, is how we say it. So we have general revenue, and that's really kind of the main state funding made up of some of the big items we just talked about. So lottery proceeds, the state tax revenues. Then we also have general revenue dedicated. And these are things considered appropriated funds as well, but it's things like tuition revenue. The state parks are included in there, and some Department of Insurance operating funds. We also, of course, receive federal funds, grants from federal government, and then some employee benefits for the federal programs as well. And then just other state funds, state highway fund, mobility fund, bond proceeds, trust fund, available university fund, and that really is mostly impactful for University of Texas at Austin and Texas A&M. So just a breakdown of the different funding sources and how they make up the state budget. So about 47% is our general revenue. Definitely the biggest part here. But then federal funds are a large part as well, and then you can see the other and the general revenue dedicated, about 4%. For the $200.4 billion budget by function, so the different agencies and functions that the state performs for the state of Texas, health and, whoops, hit the wrong button here. Health and Human Services, about 37%, and then public education, 28%. Higher education is still a pretty good chunk, 9% of the overall budget. For just the general revenue portion, changes a little bit, and higher education actually receives about 14% of the general revenue portion of the budget. So that $95 billion that we were looking at earlier, our portion is about 14%. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about formula funding. And again, this is general academic institutions, not the health institutions. So formula funding is really a way to distribute state funds, equitably distribute state funds available to higher education institutions. There's also non-formula funding that's available. And there are things like special items. For the University of Texas, special items are things like the McDonald Observatory. So that's not something that would be funded by a general allocation of formula funding. It's a unique entity that provides a different service to the state. It's not just typical teaching and research. And so that's one example of a special item. Other institutions have similar type items as well. But those are outside of the formula. It's special funding handled by the state legislature, and they determine the amount of funding for those. Available university fund is also not part of the formula funding. That's through the state constitution, and we have an investment company that handles the distribution of those funds. There's also higher education fund, group insurance fund. So those are special funds to over and above the formula funding that also assist with higher education funding. So what functions do the formulas fund for higher education? It's the basic university services, the core services. So our faculty salaries, our departmental operating expenses, the libraries, instructional administration, which is kind of the dean's offices and the college administration, research enhancement in some cases, the student services to serve our many students and the needs that they have. Institutional support is just kind of like me, somebody who handles some of the operations of the university. And then infrastructure support, how we maintain our buildings and pay the utilities, those types of things. And again, things that aren't in the formula funding, I have, McDonald Observatory is our example, but there's also tuition revenue bonds that may be appropriated by the legislature to fund mostly large renovation and new building acquisitions or construction. Texas Competitive Knowledge Fund is a fund that emerging and established research institutions receive special funding based on, it's a separate formula, but it is not the basic operations formula. There's also Research Development Fund for research institutions, and then AUF auxiliary and other institutional funding we'll talk about in a little bit, but that is also not included in the formula funding. So there's two main components of the formula funding: the instruction and operations formula, the infrastructure support, and in the infrastructure support there's also some additional recognition that small institutions may not have the same economies of scale, so they get a little supplement through that. And then there's a kind of a subsidiary formula, teaching experience, and we'll talk about each of those a little bit. So the instruction and operations formula, well, all of these are really driven by credit hours, semester credit hours. So that's a really important component of the formula funding. The instruction and operations formula is really driven by expense per credit hour. Infrastructure support has a lot of other pieces to it, but credit hours taught are also part of that. And then teaching experience is really by the number of undergraduate credit hours taught by tenure or tenure track faculty. So extra credit for not having TAs, basically teach our undergraduate students. There's two concepts to how to calculate and how the formula is generated. So there's a base period and weighted semester credit hours. The base period is really the semesters of the summer and fall of the even-numbered years and the spring of the odd-numbered years. So it's really to get the most up-to-date information before the legislative session. So those are the 3 semesters used. And it's 12-month base period. It's used for the next biennium. All right, weighted semester credit hours. this is really a way to reflect the differences in costs. So when you look at a liberal arts education, it's probably not going to be as costly as, say, an engineering or a scientific educational endeavor, because you have laboratories in science, you have equipment you have to acquire, those types of things. And so we do some cost studies to get information to the coordinating board on the different costs of the different types of academic coursework. Again, graduate courses will be more expensive than undergraduate courses. So that's all recognized in the formula matrix. I'm going to skip this and go back to it for a minute. Here's what the formula matrix looks like. And this is actually in the state appropriations bill. And it lists all the different categories, disciplines of higher education coursework, and how they're weighted. So you can see at the very top, liberal arts, lower division is 1. So it's basically rated the lowest. You get to some of these others, optometry, in doctoral programs, those are a lot more expensive. You have smaller classes, you have different types of faculty teaching. Faculty costs may be higher in those cases. And so what happens is there's an actual calculation for each type, all the semester credit hours that we have, go through, and in this example you have, say, 20 students enrolled in a history course, which is liberal arts. 20 students, it's 3 semester credit hours times 1 weight. Do the same thing for, every category. It's a huge endeavor. The coordinating board helps us, or does all of these calculations. We provide the data, they do the calculations. Not a small endeavor. And so, getting from weighted semester credit hour to the actual instruction and operations income formula, we take those numbers and calculate it across the university, or the coordinating board does. And so the legislature sets the value per weighted semester credit hour. So currently it's 54.86. Again, that will be in the appropriations bill. The legislature sets the amount that they're going to allocate to higher education. And so again, just a calculation. So before we came up with 60 weighted semester credit hours by taking those 20 students, 3 semester credit hours, there's a 60 weighted semester credit hours times 54.86. So if we only had 20 students, we'd get $3,292 for those 20 students. Same for the other calculations. But you can kind of see it in the matrix. For 20 students in these various disciplines, that's how the calculations would be done. So very simplified overview, but that's basically what it is. Anything you want to add to that, Susan? Okay. So then there's also, so that's the instruction and operations support. So that really funds the basic faculty, the libraries, the basic operations. But then there's also infrastructure support. And infrastructure support is really meant to recognize that we also have to maintain buildings and we have utility costs. And so that is calculated using predicted square footage. Notice it's not the space that the university actually has. It's really what the predicted space is, or what we should have based on the number of students, the different types of students, the types of facilities that we have. It's based on that, not what we actually have. And it also provides support for utilities. There is a rate adjustment to recognize that different localities have different utility rates, so it may be higher in Austin than it is in some other smaller city and state of Texas. And again, there's a small institution supplement to recognize that they don't have the economies of scale that someone like the University of Texas at Austin does. Okay, and so I think I didn't mention, So the predicted square footage is also based on the space projection model. So the space projection model, a bunch of different factors. And again, the coordinating board takes our data, calculates it all for all of us. And so it looks at teaching space, library space, research space, office space, and then general support space. So a lot of different factors go into this infrastructure formula. And we do provide the data on a regular basis. Teaching experience, again, is a smaller portion of the formula, but it's an extra 10% weight, and it looks at the courses that we're teaching using undergraduate courses using tenure and tenure track faculty instead of TAs and adjunct faculty. And, as I pointed out earlier, it is a distribution process. So it is not, you don't just go through these calculations and every institution gets what the calculation is. It's based on the growth, basically, in weighted semester credit hours. So institutions that are growing faster really benefit from the growth in their institution. So it's really, you got a piece of the pie and how you allocate that piece of the pie. University of Texas at Austin right now is not growing, and so that could impact our funding. And then after we go through all those calculations, how does it end up? So appropriations by function, again, across higher education, the instruction and operations formula is about 61% of the overall. And then you can see the different, the infrastructure formula about 12%, and then smaller amounts for these other more specialized special items, tuition revenue bonds, and other type funds. So that is a very, very high-level view of how this works. Are there any questions? I can pause now.
Mary, on the infrastructure formula, you didn't talk about any money there.
About the predicted space model.
Well, the space model, but how much money is allocated there?
How much money is allocated there? Well, it's, I mean, overall, it's about 12%, so $501 million across the state. But each institution gets it based on their predicted square footage, so it's an allocation.
It's just a set amount and it's set aside in whether inflation is going up or...
Yes, and it is split kind of between utilities and maintenance, and there's that also kind of gets determined by the legislature still currently, or yeah, you make recommendations. The higher coordinating board makes recommendations. Always, the coordinating board makes recommendations. The legislature can change those recommendations.
The only thing I would add to what Mary said is that this is how the money is earned. It does not mean that is how the institution has to spend the money, with the exception of debt payments for tuition revenue bonds. That has to be spent for that purpose and only for that purpose. The rest of it is up to y'all on how that money is allocated to the different departments and that sort of thing.
We do get special items, I would add, too. Special items, so we get funding for McDonald Observatory. Say it's $3 million, we spend that $3 million on McDonald Observatory. How we spend it on McDonald Observatory is up to us. But there are some line items in the budget, but again, that's correct. We don't have to spend it exactly the way it's allocated.
Question for Susan. On the INO formula, who determines the $54? And is that
The $54 is actually determined by by the LDB. And what they do is they look at the amount of money that the legislature provides to general academic for the INO process. They look at the total number of weighted semester credit hours from all the institutions, and then they kind of back into how much per weighted semester credit hour everybody's going to get. Okay?
You know, I have a question. How much is allocated towards heat in this process?
The higher education fund, I think that can vary with the legislature, but
Right now, it's $262.5 million each year. We have a recommendation that has just gone forward to them to raise it up to $365 million per year. But that's a recommendation.
You mean,
What was that word?
I believe the value is probably close to 14 million, billion. Does that sound about right? There are certain requirements of the allocation, but basically it's split between UT System and Texas A&M, and Texas A&M gets 1/3, University of Texas 2/3, and then there's allocations for the system operations for each of those institutions, and then for the UT Austin side, about 45% of the residual income goes to UT Austin. So right now it's about, I've got the exact amount here, about six.
Doesn't it vary by
Oh, it
year
varies.
based on the royalties from the holdings in West Texas?
Yeah.
Right?
And it's
14 billion in the fund and maybe
100
100 million a year.
176 million is the UT Austin recurring amount for 14-15. There are some additional allocations that go on top of that may be one time. I don't know the A&M amount, but probably.
You know, there's an article thought at some point. I mean, I think for 14, 15, the UT's portion was probably almost 400 million total, based on the value of the royalties coming out of the West Texas land.
Right, and some of it goes to the Permanent University Fund, which is allocated to all of the institutions for facilities.
That can be spent only on facilities.
Right.
Only Austin is, and A&M have operational, they could use it for operational purposes, for excellence. But it's part of the Constitution. I mean, this is not like anybody could come in and decide what to do.
Yeah,
Constitution.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about some legislative funding issues, just some of the big ones. There's always a lot, and we never know what's going to come up in the session, but some things that have been high on the list for a couple years. So the outcomes-based funding, and this is still kind of a work in progress, and the higher education, the coordinating board has had committees working on this for a couple years, but the basic principles are to allocate some funds based on outcomes. So currently the formulas are all based on semester credit hours, how many students you're teaching, but not how well you're teaching those students. Are they graduating? Those types of things. And so it's something that's going to be phased in. The recommendation is that it be over and above the formula funding of $235 million. And then the metrics for it are scaled and weighted based on priorities for each institution. There's also some funding set aside for hold harmless so that institutions aren't impacted to a large amount. I can't remember what the percentage is, about 1%, 0.5%, and 1% the second. Yeah. And so these are the success metrics that were recommended, and again, each institution can kind of select their priorities based on the mission of the university. And then that will be, their prioritization will be effective for a 3-year period. 3 biennium, thank you, 3 biennium. So I won't go into all the details of that, but again, another complication and all the data that's coming in to handle that is
It was based on data that we already collect, so that we're not having to collect additional information. We made sure that We're not increasing the reporting burden at the same time, so what we're doing is all based on data that we already have.
And then
Ma'am,
the other,
I'm sorry, if I could ask a couple questions about the outcome-based funding.
Sure.
Is there a proposal to phase this in?
Yes.
And are there percentages that have already been determined as you phase it in? I mean, I know, for example, the community college is 10% of the last session. Was
Right.
a portion based on outcomes-based funding? It wasn't, so the 90% was the same?
Right.
Is there a proposal for higher education that the Court of Board is recommending for this upcoming session?
Yes, the 235 million recommendation came from, that is 10% of the undergraduate funding.
Okay.
Is what that is equivalent to. It's equivalent to 10% of undergraduate. It is only, the metrics are all based on undergraduate, as David mentioned earlier today. Undergraduate education is really the driver, economic driver for the state, so we focused all the outcomes on undergraduate education. So that's why it's only 10% of the undergraduate education.
And then is there a plan to gradually
There
increase
is not,
that?
at this point, there is no recommendation to increase that amount
Okay.
until we get, I think it would be premature to start increasing the amount until you see what you're going to get from maturity.
I do understand.
That's
I wonder
the
what's being
stance the
proposed
board
by
has.
coordinating.
No, there is no proposal from the coordinating board to increase until we see how things are laying out and that sort of thing. Okay.
all right. Fixed tuition is something that the 83rd legislature, so the last session, passed a requirement that each institution offer a fixed tuition program, and so that would be incoming freshmen starting in the fall of 2014 had an option to select fixed tuition, which would keep their tuition at the same rate that they started for 12 consecutive semesters. So every institution now has that option. They've been implemented in a little bit different ways across the different systems in the state, but all students have that ability to choose that. All right. So what do we do on our campuses, and how does the budget process go for us? Here's just some general figures for the state as a whole, for the general academic institutions. So we've focused on a smaller number of higher education institutions. $12.2 billion, and about 28% is state appropriated. For University of Texas at Austin, that figure is close to 12%, but some of the other higher education institutions, the figure's higher. Tuition, now you can see, is actually higher than our state appropriations right now. We do receive federal funds and then various institutional resources. Again, color of money, different colors of money. We already talked about most of these, so the appropriated funds. But the higher education also has other funds, other funding sources, designated funds. So outside of the tuition that is part of the state appropriations, there's also designated tuition. And I can't remember what year that passed, but we probably around the 2002, 2003, right? So designated tuition is tuition that is set by each Board of Regents, or the Board of Regents for a system. There's also some incidental fees included in there, and then indirect cost recovery is funds that we receive because we receive federal grants, so they also pay kind of the indirect costs of those federal grants. And that's part of our funding. Auxiliary enterprises are self-supporting activities, athletics, Texas Union, housing and food. So they run almost like mini businesses on the campus. They pay for their own utilities, they pay for their own buildings, they pay their own staff, they pay their own fringe benefits. So they really are on their own bottom. but they are part of our institution. We report them as part of our institutional budget. Restricted funds, they are funds that are restricted for use. So when we get a gift, we have to use that gift for the purpose in which the donor intended. We get an endowment, same kind of thing. They are endowing a chair in the College of Engineering or something like that. Federal, state, local grants and contracts, they have some kind of requirement that we fulfill a research endeavor, usually a research endeavor of some type, and have a deliverable. So all of those funds, we don't have any choice on how they're spent. We have to spend them the way that we receive them. Okay, so when we go through a budget development cycle, if it is a legislative year, which we're about to come up on, so this past March, we started working on our, this coming March, because we're talking about legislative year, so 2015. So in March, we'll start developing some initial budget policies, but we can't finalize those because we don't know what's going to happen in the legislative session. We don't know what our funding is going to be yet, but we're starting to formulate some policies for the university. April and May, the colleges and schools and departments actually start preparing their budgets based on those initial policy decisions. The end of May, the session ends. So it starts in January, session ends in May, and at that time, we might get additional instructions from our Board of Regents. We might get additional instructions. The president wants to make some different policies. Maybe we got additional funding. We want to allocate some salary money or those types of things. So we'll make adjustments in the June timeframe. Generally, the budgets are centrally received and consolidated, and then they go to the UT system and the Board of Regents for approval in the month of August. And then the operating budget will be effective September of 2015. The legislative appropriation request, have all of you seen these at your campuses? Really exciting stuff. But this is something that we prepare in the summer before a legislative session, and it's really our request for state funding only. We don't request formula funding because the formulas are determined by the legislature based on the recommendations from the coordinating board, but it includes financial details, some historical information, and if we have new requests for funding in the legislative request, or LAR, you might hear that terminology also, they're called exceptional items, so they're new requests. Once they get approved by the legislature, they become special items, and they're part of the appropriations bill. But that's something that we prepare, and it goes to the Legislative Budget Board. It has information. I'll pass it around if any of you want to peek through it. But it has information, kind of an introduction. The president talks about his or her priorities, and then the rest of it is really a lot of schedules to help the Legislative Budget Board collect all of our data, similar to the way the Coordinating Board collects our data. Legislative Budget Board collects each institution's data, consolidates it, puts it together, and provides information to the legislature so that they can make decisions for the state as a whole. And there's fiscal notes that are going on during the session, so we prepare financial impacts of bills and those types of things. I think we're running low on time. 9:45 is the next one, so let me kind of run through these. We're also analyzing bills. We're analyzing the appropriations, the financial impact that we might get. The House and the Senate will come out with bills during the session. We're evaluating those. What impact does it have on UT Austin, and how will it impact our budget? So we're really pouring through the numbers as the session goes on, and they change, on a regular basis, the numbers. So in a non-legislative year, we already know what the appropriations are because they appropriate funds for a 2-year period. So for starting in 2016-17, we'll already know, and so we don't have that period of the unknown, and we go through the process to prepare the budget. There are a lot of external influences for budget policies and priorities of the university. So, of course, the Board of Regents, donors and alumni sometimes get involved in university issues. Legislature, of course, parents are very interested in tuition policies, just the general public and the media. So a lot of influences that we address during either the legislative session or during the budget building process and the tuition process. Things to consider as we're preparing our budgets, potential funding sources that we could have, including what our state appropriations are, looking at any incremental expenditures that we might have for new initiatives, as well as cost reduction opportunities. So we're at the University of Texas, we're looking at some shared services and other cost reduction methods, just because, you know, we need to take care of our priorities. So we're prioritizing academic instruction and teaching over operations and, you know, general administrative functions. And then we look at, you know, if we get to having a shortfall at any period, we might consider designated tuition increases and work with our board on that. So that was really all I wanted to cover, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I know next session is about to start, so may be brief, but I'm happy to help. Anything else?